Reasons Calvin's election doctrine cannot be taught from Genesis 25:32. 1. This is not an election of an individual, therefore it cannot be used as a model of how God elect individuals to salvation or reprobation. It was the nation of Israel that was spoken of by God to Rebekah, not Jacob as a person. 2. It was not an election to personal salvation. Personal salvation was not offered yet in that dispensation. It was not about New Testament redemption. Redemption as we know it in the New Testament was wrought by Christ and was not known to the patriarchs in the dispensation of promise. God did not mention that to Rebekah, because that was not the point he was making to her. Apparently, it was never God's intent that personal salvation be taught from this historical Jewish-only related event. Chapter 3 Part 2 The election of Jacob from the dispensational perspective. The election of Jacob over Esau occurred in the dispensation of promise, under the covenant of Abraham, in the patriarchal period, as recorded in the Pentateuch. In this part of the chapter we discuss the dispensational relevance of the election of Jacob. Here we further prove that Calvin's doctrine of predestination and unconditional election didn't come from Genesis 25:32. It came from Augustinism as we discussed in Book I. The following definition of a dispensation is used in our discussion. Scofield. C.I. Scofield states, The New Scofield Study Bible, NIV, Oxford University Press, New York, 1967, p. 3. A dispensation is a period during which man is tested in respect to his obedience to some specific revelation of the will of God. 3 important concepts are implied in this definition. 1. A deposit of divine revelation concerning God's will, embodying what God requires of man as to his conduct. 2. Man's stewardship of this divine revelation, in which he is responsible to obey it. 3. A time period, often called an age, during which this divine revelation is dominant in the testing of man's obedience to God. The dispensations are a progressive and connected revelation of God's dealings with man, given sometimes to the whole race and at other times to a particular people, Israel. These different dispensations are not separate ways of salvation. The dispensations relative to the election of Jacob. This scripture Gen 25:32 must be interpreted within the meanings, values, covenants, and promises of that dispensation. The election of Jacob must be seen in the light of its place in the dispensations. There are some significant things about the dispensations that will answer the question, was God discussing personal salvation when he told Rebekah that 2 nations were in her womb? Here in this section, we discuss the relevance of the dispensations to the election of Jacob, and what God said to Rebekah about it. The relationship of the dispensations to the election of Jacob. Relative to this story, God's dealings with man in the first 4 dispensations, innocence, conscience, human government, and promise matter, and must be taken into consideration in the interpretation of the meaning of what God said to Rebekah in Genesis 25:32. What must be kept in mind is that the dispensation of promise, wherein God spoke to Rebekah, was the first one of the 2 exclusive dispensations, promise and the law, where God had excluded the entire world, other than the family of Abraham, from his dealings, which included his appeals, His revelations, His promises, His spiritual blessing, and His covenants. The world was scattered and disfellowshipped from God and were not privy to these things of God. Innocence. Inclusive. Universal call. Conscience. Inclusive. Universal call. Human government. Inclusive. Universal call. Promise. Exclusive. Only to the proxy family. Law. Exclusive. Only to the proxy nation. Grace. Inclusive. Universal call. Kingdom. Kingdom age. Dispensation. Prior to the dispensation of promise, God appealed universally to mankind in the dispensations of innocence, conscience, and finally human government. These first three dispensations were different from the dispensation of promise and the dispensation of the law, which were exclusively to the Hebrews. In the dispensation of promise Gen 12 Exodus 20 God was not on speaking terms with the rest of the world. They were excluded from the dealings of God. This is what is meant by promise and law being exclusive dispensations. But the other dispensations were universally inclusive, i.e., innocence, conscience, and human government. These all were universally inclusive. They included God's dealings and appeals to the entire human race. So, we say these are three of the four universally inclusive dispensations, where God called all men everywhere, of every race, and every nation to a relationship with Him. The inclusive dispensations are innocence, conscience, human government, and grace. In these inclusive dispensations God made covenants universally. The other inclusive dispensations came after the two exclusive ones, promise and law. It is the dispensation of grace, the church age, that is universally inclusive, such that the call of God is universal. It is to whosoever will come. As we look back at the first three dispensations, innocence, conscience, and human government, it was the dispensation of human government which ended in the expulsion of the human race from the fellowship of God, which was scattered, shut out, and alienated from God's dealings. This shutout and alienation existed from the Tower of Babel to the ingathering, beginning at Pentecost. For our purposes in this thesis, it must be noted that the events of the dispensation of promise where the Esau and Jacob story occurred was in that era. It happened during the period of the scattering and alienation of the whole world, except for the family of Abraham. Why do we need to note this? Because if God was not dealing with the scattered world in this passage General 25, then the message given to Rebekah was not to the scattered alienated world. Then it is not universal. Then it is not in the least what the Calvinists guess at it being. Then this is another hermeneutical proof that this passage has nothing to do with the eternal salvation of the whole human race, some to heaven and some to hell, not in the least. In this we show the dispensational perspective of the election of Jacob. The beginning of the period of exclusiveness was the call of Abraham and the start of the dispensation of promise. The dispensation that began with this covenant of Abraham is called the dispensation of promise for obvious reasons. For the first time God has made promises to one group of people at the exclusion of all others. From the time of Abraham on in the Old Testament, the only way someone other than an Israelite could partake of the promises was to become an Israelite himself. Ruth, for example, Ruth 1:16. Again, the only way now is to be born again of the water and of the Spirit. By some, this dispensation is called the dispensation of the family because everything God had to say to man he said to this one family. The promises he made to Abraham he reconfirmed to his son Isaac, his grandson Jacob, and then to Jacob's sons, the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. The manner of behavior God expected in this dispensation is much like the previous, except that he told Abraham to go to a certain land and stay there, Canaan. How to make sense of the differences